What's up, guys? Nuance Bro checking in. As I'm sure many of you have heard, unless you've been living under a rock, there have been attacks against Asian people, and I'm sure you've seen hashtags like stopasianhate. And especially in light of the pandemic, post-pandemic, there's been a lot of these anti-Asian attacks. They've gained more prominence in the media. And generally speaking, people have come together to identify this as a real problem. The problem, however, is that many people, our media establishment, politicians, our institutions, aren't exactly honest about who is disproportionately responsible for these attacks on the Asian community. As you can see here in this NBC News piece, viral images show people of color as anti-Asian perpetrators. That misses the big picture. A new analysis reveals misconceptions about perpetrators, victims, and the general environment around anti-Asian hate incidents. These can have, quote, long-term consequences for racial solidarity, researcher Janelle Wong said. While news reports and social media have perpetrated the idea that anti-Asian violence is committed mostly by people of color, a new analysis shows the majority of attackers are white. So if you've been paying attention to this issue at all in the last couple years, you'd be hard-pressed to think that the vast majority of these violent instances, these attacks on Asian Americans, has been coming from white people. This is an issue that I've been following very closely. I was born and raised in San Francisco, which is a very disproportionately Asian city. And given that many of these attacks have been happening in the Bay Area in California, it's an issue that I've been keeping my eye on for quite some time. So seeing this claim, I had to look into it and dig into the data a bit more. But before we get into that, I want to give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Ground News. So much of today's media is littered with bias, and with that, you often get misled not just by what they choose to cover, but more often by what they choose not to cover. That's why I'm very passionate about Ground News and have been using them for years now. Ground News is a first-of-its-kind website and app that lets you compare how a single news story is being covered across the political spectrum. It's not simply a news aggregator, it's a tool with tons of easy-to-use features that help you analyze the news so you can be confident you're getting the whole story. The bias distribution chart shows you which media outlets are reporting on an issue and where they fall on the political spectrum. You can even compare headlines to how phrasing changes between news outlets. One of the best features has to be the blind spot feed, which shows you stories that are underreported on the left and the right, which you can use to break out of any echo chamber you find yourself in. So if you're looking for a better way to stay informed about current events around the world, check out Ground News by visiting ground.news/nuancebro to download the free app. Links as always in the description box down below. So as you can see, the person that they cite is Janelle Wong, who I'm sure if we go to her Twitter page, she's going to just be a normal human being, not very politically biased, just pure researcher that you can trust. All right, let's take a look here. So we have Janelle S. Wong, Asian American Studies, political scientist, race, immigrants. We can see that she's the co-director of an organization that seeks to lift up Asian American voices for progressive policy positions, racial equity, hashtag Black Lives Matter. We can see her pinned tweet here is basically criticizing people who oppose Harvard's racist admissions process that actually hurts Asian Americans. So she's willing to hurt Asian Americans, but she's framing it in a way to make it look like the racist practices are good for Asians, even though Asians are like the ones suing these people for being discriminated against. Here's another one where she's retweeting someone that says, experts framing affirmative action as anti-Asian bias is dangerous, talking about how it's an old tactic in the white supremacy playbook. Okay, definitely not biased there. Here's another one where she talks about Martin Luther King being a critical race theorist, because clearly that's something she supports. Here she is retweeting someone criticizing the Rittenhouse decision and showing how white conservative and Christian people believe that violence may be necessary to save the country, disparaging these folks. Here she again retweets this Robert P. Jones guy talking about how powerfully white supremacy is driving political divides. So yeah, you can already sense just a smidge of bias there. Anyways, the major paper that she focuses on, as well as the NBC News piece, is this paper, Virulent Hate Plus Reports, Anti-Asian Racism in 2020. So they are the Virulent Hate Project at the University of Michigan. They reviewed 4,337 news articles published between January 1st and December 31st, 2020. They identified 1,023 incidents of anti-Asian racism, which included 679 incidents of anti-Asian harassment, vandalism, and 344 incidents of stigmatizing and discriminatory statements, blah, blah, blah. Here they mentioned that 112 harassment incidents involved physical harassment and violence, which is 16.49% of the total. And here you can see them say, in the incidents for which there were reported details about the individuals who were the source of anti-Asian harassment, discrimination, and stigmatization, the majority of the offenders were identified as male, white, and in the case of politicians, affiliated with the Republican Party. So here's the funny part: methods and sources. We read through news articles, identified unique incidents of racism and activism, and entered these incidents into a database. We assigned tags for each incident based on the information made available in the news article, with particular focus on gathering details about the type, date, and location of the incidents, the demographics of the victims and perpetrators, and the deployment of specific stereotypes in anti-Asian rhetoric. And going back to the NBC News article that talks about this study, they mentioned that they found that upward of 75% of news stories identified perpetrators as male and white in instances of physical or verbal assault and harassment when the race of the perpetrator was confirmed. So immediately upon reading this, I was thinking, damn, 75%. I wonder how many cases that is. 75% of what? So this is where it gets amazing. Here's what I want you all to do at home. I want you to think back to 2020. I want you to think through that entire year, all the instances of anti-Asian hate that you saw, physical attacks in particular, where you saw different types of suspects and all that, but in particular, black suspects, and where the hatred motive, the hate motive was fairly clear. I want you to think, how many instances do you think, maybe not even that you could remember, but if you had to guess, how many instances do you think nationwide there would be that this report would capture? Take a guess. You have a number in your head? Well, let's go back to the study because I think this is probably going to amaze you. So remember, this was 4,337 news articles published between January 1st and December 31st, 2020, where they identified 1,023 incidents of anti-Asian racism, of which 112 were harassment incidents that involved physical harassment and violence. This is what we're talking about. And how many of those do they attribute to black people? Drum roll, please. 3. Throughout the entire year of 2020, this paper identifies 3 instances of black suspects physically harassing Asian people. So this is the kind of proof the media is running with to say that white people are committing most of the anti-Asian hate, where they can only find 3 instances of black people committing these attacks, when almost all of us who have been keeping up with the news, watching these incidents happen, whether it's on Twitter or other platforms, all the video surveillance coming out. I mean, if you follow Betty Yu in San Francisco or Dion Lim in San Francisco, you've definitely seen more than 3 in the year 2020. In fact, let me go over a few articles myself. And for these instances, I'm only going to choose New York. I'm not going to focus anywhere else for these next few examples. So we're not focusing nationwide. We're focusing on one city in America. So here we have the NYPD Hate Crimes Unit talking about an anti-Asian COVID-related hate crime assault that occurred on December 17th, 2020 at 1:45 p.m. And these are the suspects that they're looking for. They don't quite look white to me. Here's another one from the NYPD Hate Crimes Unit, where it states the person pictured is wanted for an assault on an Asian woman using COVID-19 related statements on March 28th. And you can see this was posted April 7th, 2020. Here's another one posted on the New York Post, May 17th, 2020. The footage again from NYPD Crime Stoppers. It says a xenophobic strap hanger hurled anti-Chinese vitriol at an Asian woman on a subway in Manhattan, but the victim managed to snap video of her attacker, cops said Sunday. You effing Chinese don't speak English. Go back to China. Let's take a look at the video. Doesn't quite look like a white individual to me. Here's another example we can see on CNN if we scroll down. Again, from the NYPD Hate Crimes Unit. This happened apparently on February 2nd, 2020, where one witness said that she heard a man call the woman who appeared Asian a diseased bitch because she was wearing a mask. Let's take a look at the footage.
Yo, come don't fucking touch me! Don't fucking touch me!
Yet another suspect that doesn't look white to me. So that's more than 3 incidents right there in New York City alone in the year 2020. But they only put 3 for the entire nation. The key point here is to remember that this article is talking about them explicitly mentioning the race in the article. They're not even talking about there being a picture of the suspect and them being able to identify the race themselves. It has to be confirmed in the article in language. What this study really says is that the media is not honest with people when it comes to who the suspects are. They don't want to write black, what the race is. They might show it sometimes. Even then, they oftentimes try to step away from that because they feel like that might contribute to negative stereotypes. For example, the show Cops has often been criticized by more progressive members of society for showing minorities in a negative light. This was one of the criticisms by Michael Moore when he sat down and spoke to one of the producers on the show, where he mentioned how the media demonizes people of color.
Maybe because we, in the television business, because we tend to demonize Black and Hispanic people, then those watching it at home are going, I don't want to help those people. I'm not going to do anything to help them because I hate them now because they may hurt me. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying. I'm not sure that's what we're doing. I don't think we show Black and Hispanic people as being criminals. I'd like to say not more often, but probably they are more often. But I certainly don't think we're certainly not trying to demonize Black and Hispanic people.
We show them on the news, we show them on TV as pretty scary people.
And I agree. I think I'd like to see that reversed as much as possible.
So you could see there the former producer guy on the show Cops. Earlier in the interview, he talked about how liberal he was and things like that. But he was saying he would like to see that reversed as soon as possible. What is that? He's talking about the demonization of people of color. So what do? They go and even though they might have shot more scenes or seen Black people commit crimes more often in that show, they would edit the show to show white people disproportionately committing crime compared to how they actually commit crime in the real world. Don't believe me? Think I'm making that up? Let's actually see what the creator of Cops had to say to Ben Shapiro when Ben Shapiro interviewed him years ago and was recording the conversation for his book Primetime Propaganda. This was well over a decade ago. Let's take a look at what the creator of the show Cops had to say.
What irritates me sometimes is critics will watch something and say, oh, look at Cops, they misrepresent people of color. That's absolutely not true. It's au contraire. I show more white people than statistically what the truth is in terms of street crime. I mean, if you look at the prisons, it's 60-something percent of people of color and 30-something percent of white people, right? If you look at Cops, it's 60% white, 40%. It's just the reverse. And I do that intentionally because I don't want to contribute to negative stereotypes.
So there you could see even the show Cops, that's often held up as this racist show that demonizes Black people by, progressives and things like that, people like Michael Moore. That's simply not the case. Even they lie to skew the numbers in favor of people of color because they are progressives themselves. This is why you're seeing policies more often in a lot of these metro areas and these metro police departments where they are not showing booking photos of the suspects, whereas they used to in the past. You can see this with the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, BART, in the Bay Area, saying that they're withholding surveillance videos of crime to avoid stereotypes. Here you could see the agency issued an explanation for why it is being tight-lipped about the thefts. The thefts that they're talking about in particular are these 3 instances here. So 40 to 60 kids boarded a train at the Coliseum stop and robbed 7 passengers, beating up 2. A group of 4 kids assaulted a passenger and made off with a cell phone at Dublin. And June 30th, a woman on a train with about a dozen teenagers had her phone snatched by one of them before the group got off at the Coliseum stop. Thankfully, a good Samaritan was on hand to retrieve the phone. And the statement was, quote, "To release these videos would create a high level of racial insensitive commentary toward the district," she was told. And in addition, it would create a racial bias in the riders against minorities on the train. Isn't that fascinating? Reality would make people racially insensitive. They would have a bias against the people or the group of people and their physical characteristics. They would have a bias harbored towards people like that if they saw reality. And as I was reading the description of those thefts, I think we all know the image that pops up in our heads. It's reality. They literally won't show us reality because they say, hey, reality is racist. It'll make you racist. Don't look at reality. The San Francisco Police Department, which I used to see all the time post booking photos, only 2 years ago, they used to do that. I used to go on their Twitter page and they would show it all the time. They don't do that anymore. You can see that here from ABC 7 News, San Francisco police to stop releasing mugshots. They talk about how it undermines the presumption of innocence and helps perpetuate stereotypes. And they list other large cities that have done this, like Los Angeles and New York. And of course, not everyone who's arrested is guilty, and they oftentimes won't be convicted. Sometimes that's for legitimate reasons. Sometimes that's because the prosecutor sucks. Various reasons play into it. But generally speaking, transparency is a good thing. We want transparency from our government officials. We want to know what's going on in our community. If there's a crime that takes place, we should be allowed to see surveillance footage of that. But they're hiding it from us because they say, well, that's going to make you more racist and it's just too racially insensitive. Oh, it's too racially inflammatory because you'll see the footage and it's obvious what's going on there. And, hide the information from the people is how they prefer to deal with it. But I want to get back to the numbers when it comes to these anti-Asian incidents, in particular, the physical assaults, the physical harassment, because it's one thing to say, oh, well, someone looked at me weird, or they might have moved away from me because they, racially associated me with COVID or something. That's a bit more ambiguous. It's not as visible. You're not going to have surveillance footage of things like that. That's not going to make the news. It's a bit more ambiguous. It's not as clear and it's not as harmful, right? If someone's wailing down on you, punching you, shooting you, stabbing you, killing you, like that's a lot worse than a perceived slight at you verbally or even nonverbal. So those are the instances I really want to focus in on here because it's the most egregious, and we have those numbers from that study that we were looking at earlier, again, where they identified 112 physical harassment incidents. And the reason I want to bring that up is because that's what they're claiming for the entire year of 2020. And of that 112, they found 16 examples where the offenders were explicitly identified in the news, like in the article itself. They're not capturing all the data. If they did, it would show a different picture, especially if they did their analysis properly, where they actually didn't just look at the article, read the article for an explicit explanation. They actually looked at the footage, or they tried to, send Freedom of Information Act requests to the police department to pull up the records of the people who committed these acts. The study would look a lot different. But again, keep that 112 number in mind because we're going to look at a case right now. One case, okay? Check this out. San Jose police arrest prolific robbery crew for crimes targeting Asian women. And here you can see the 6 suspects. If the racial category is unclear to you, maybe ask somebody in the comments. I'm sure they could clear it up for you. And here we can see that more than 100 Asian women were victims of this violent gang. Also, a lot of this detective work was done by a female detective, Estentino. She was able to link them to 177 of these robberies. So the number is probably even higher, but this is what they've been able to find. This is what they've been able to confirm. So more than 100 Asian women, 177 robberies. And the district attorney of San Jose, his name's Jeffrey Rosen, he said that the defendants targeted the victims because they assumed the women, who were almost all of Asian descent, didn't use banks and carried cash. They also used ethnic slurs to refer to the victims. So remember that 112 number from the earlier study? Well, this blows it out of the water. This one case, this one group of 6 individuals, this happened between October 2020 and September 2021. So some of that happened in the year 2020, but it spanned about a year. Just this case alone, 6 people. They did more physical assaults, more physical harassment, hate incidents towards Asian people than that entire study found across the country, regardless of whether race was included or not. The numbers are ridiculous. We're talking nearly 200 incidents from this case alone. And I want to go into this particular aspect of blacks targeting Asians because they don't believe they use banks, as you saw in this article. They targeted Asians because they didn't use banks and carried cash. This is a very common shared belief by many of these black criminals. Here you can see an example of an Asian family where some of the young members are explaining why they were targeted for a home break-in.
Talked to the police told us, and my mom too, she was like, why did this happen to us? Like, we don't even look like much, right? And they told us, you know, they target Asian households, they look for Asian families, and, you know,
Thinking there might be cash or jewelry.
Yeah, it's usually Asian families that do that, right?
Yeah.
That keep money in the household.
I don't think people understand how common and popularized this idea is, especially with criminals in the black community who target these people, because it's popularized even in rap songs that are designed as instruction manuals for criminals. This comes from the YG song. I'm sure many of you know YG, very popular, well-known rapper. He sang a song back in the day called Meet the Flockas, where the song is literally an instruction manual on who to target for a robbery and how to commit that robbery.
First, you find a house and scope it out. Find a Chinese neighborhood, they don't believe in bank accounts. You find a crew and a driver, someone ring the doorbell, and someone that ain't scared to do what it do.
So if you didn't hear that, the song says, first, find a house and scope it out, find a Chinese neighborhood because they don't believe in bank accounts. It glorifies criminality, targeting vulnerable minority communities, and taking their shit. So I want to go to another set of data that's published by the Stop AAPI Hate organization to kind of show you what I'm talking about when it comes to, oh, well, let's list certain races, but not others when it comes to attacks on Asian people, because this organization is one of the most widely cited organizations when it comes to Asian hate, attacks on Asian people. But it's just another one of these woke groups that doesn't actually represent the interests of Asian people in an honest way. So here you can see the Stop AAPI Hate National Report, March 19th, 2020 through February 28th, 2021. They say this report covers the 3,795 incidents received by the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center from the dates that we listed before. And again, they list different types of harassment, verbal, shunning, physical assault, which is the one that we care about the most here. But of particular note, I want you to pay attention to this. We're going to look up the term white. So here we can see the first example. It says, a white man catcalled me, then aggressively followed me down the block and got inches from my face and yelled a Chinese slur and then another slur after realizing I was Asian. Lots of neighbors were standing outside their homes and no one intervened. The next example is right afterwards saying, as I was shopping, a white woman and what I am assuming was her husband came into the aisle I was in. They gave me dirty looks and just looked me up and down like they were disgusted with me. And then talks about how she came up there and said, oh, you're one of them. Next example after that. 2 white middle-aged men who have been my neighbors for over 15 years approached me threateningly on the street, pulled down the corners of their eyes and said, go back to Wuhan, bitch, and take the virus with you. So as you can see, they highlight examples where they mentioned the race of the individual as long as they're white. Now let's type black into this same report. The only black we get here is when they talk about the Black Student Union and how the San Francisco State Asian American Studies group was founded after them. The next example is from a Pew Research link that talks about how many black and Asian Americans say they have experienced discrimination amid the outbreak. But no mentions of any of the assailants, the suspects being black. Interesting. So what I decided to do is actually look at one of the instances that they put here. It was literally the first one that I saw under the physical assault category, because you read the story and it doesn't mention the race of the individual. My boyfriend and I were riding the metro into DC when on the escalator in the transfer station, a man, interesting, no racial mention there, repeatedly punched my back and pushed past us. At the top, he circled back toward us, followed us, repeatedly shouted Chinese bitch at me, fake coughed at, and physically threatened us. A few days later, we saw a news story about how the owner of Valley Brook Tea in DC was harassed and pepper sprayed by the same man, calling him, you know what, repeatedly. So isn't that interesting? So no race mentioned here. They just said a man. The next story, a white man driving a silver Mercedes, and this example, some guy drove up on the curb or something. But what I found interesting about this story is it's the first story I saw on physical assault, no race mentioned, so I already had a sense of what was going on. So I decided to look this up because they mentioned that they saw a news story about Valley Brook Tea in DC, and they saw it was the same guy who attacked them. So of course, naturally, I looked up the story myself, and look what I found. Here we see a Twitter post from Valley Brook Tea on November 10th, 2020, where it says, I don't know what to say anymore. This type of hate crime happened to us again this morning, 9:42. This person charged into our store shouting Chinese and you know what, then attacked me with pepper spray. Let's take a look at the video.
He got mask off, and it's COVID-19. Hey.
Go away.
Hey, you can go away, motherfucker.
Go away.
You go away.
Go away.
What's that?
Go away. Go away right now.
Motherfucker. You playing with me?
Go away.
You playing with me? Bitch, you playing with me?
I'm calling 911 right
I'm
now.
calling 912. You playing with me, bitch? You playing with me, bitch? Stop playing with me.
Go
Stop
away.
playing with me. I'll
Go
spray
away.
on your ass. I'll spray on your ass.
So see, you have to look into these cases yourself if you want to find anything, because usually when the suspect is black, they don't list the race of the person. If they're white, they almost always list the race of the person. Let me show you a comically insane example of this. This is from the New York Daily News, published February 5th, 2021. I was so afraid of dying. Man slashed across face on Manhattan-bound L train recounts terrifying encounter. So again, this happened in New York. And you can see this man's face is totally just slashed, extremely brutal and violent. And as you can see, this is the suspect. This is the individual who attacked him. And this is really the kicker here. Cops released surveillance images of the suspect Thursday and asked for the public's help tracking him down. He's described as between 20 and 30, wearing a black, they're talking about the jacket, wearing a black North Face jacket, red hoodie, blue jeans, and red bandana, and light-colored sneakers. Yeah, thank you for listing a bunch of articles of clothing that he's gonna take off when the day's over, and maybe tell the only useful information that you gave us is that he's a he, and that he's between 20 and 30. Nothing else mentioned, not the texture of his hair, skin color, obviously. Luckily, we have a picture here. You know, I mean, the description of the clothing was correct. The red bandana, the black North Face jacket. But again, in this entire article, they don't mention that the suspect is black. In fact, in every article I've shown you today, and I promise I didn't cherry pick, even the one with the 6 black guys who committed, the 177 incidents with over 100 Asian women that they targeted for racial reasons, as evidenced by the language that they were using with respect to those victims. In all of those articles that I've listed in this video, they never mention black. They never mention that these suspects are black. Ever. So when you have studies like that Virulent Hate study that says, oh, we looked at all the articles and this and that, they might even have pictures of the suspects. Sometimes you don't get lucky enough for that to even exist because they think that would just be, it'd be making people more racially hateful or insensitive or harbor racial biases and things like that, or exacerbate those racial biases. So they don't even put that in there. And you have to go and try to find it yourself, doing Public Records Act requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. I've had to do some of these things myself from time to time, and it's really infuriating. Ugh. But when you use the methodology that Virulent Hate study used, for example, where the race has to be explicitly listed typed in the article itself, not just an image shown, not just in the video that they show or the surveillance footage that you can look at with your eyeballs and tell, of course you're not going to get any results showing that black people attacked Asians in these instances. It's more of an indictment on the media and our institutions that don't share this information with us rather than what the data actually shows. And again, I'm going to link everything that I've shown in this video in the description box down below. So if you want to see through all that and see if I'm telling the truth or not, I mean, you can look at the articles that I listed. They don't mention the race in the article. They might show pictures sometimes, but they don't mention the race in the article. And I think it's important to keep the standard the same. If you're going to mention a race when it comes to a white man or a white woman or something like that, then keep it consistent. Mention the race or don't. If you're going to mention it for one race, then mention it for all. If you're not going to mention it for all the other ones except for white people, then don't mention it for white people either. But personally, I like to deal with more information rather than less. I like more transparency rather than less. And I think we as the public get to know. If we're paying tax dollars to the police departments, for example, we should be able to see the surveillance footage. We should be able to see who they're arresting. We should be able to see criminal records. There shouldn't be a barrier to entry to see these things. And if you've made it this far in the video, if you could help the channel out by giving us a thumbs up, it really helps with the algorithm. Share this video if you feel like someone could learn something from this video. If you've learned something yourself, leave a comment down below letting me know what you learned, what you found interesting, what you think I should have added, what I missed. Let me know. I appreciate it. Support us at nuancebro.com/join. It allows us to keep making videos like this. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Social media links are in the description box below, as well as merch. And I'll see you next time, bro.